Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is healthy and safe. Welcome to the second installment of Lighthouse's Illuminations webinar series. This week's topic is adopting a compliant and defensible remote collection strategy. My name is Chris Marzetti, and I'm an attorney and senior consultant at Lighthouse. I'm a former litigator, but have been helping legal teams develop and implement effective e-discovery processes and workflows for just about 17 years now. Joining me is Jerry Bowie, who leads Lighthouse's digital forensics team. Jerry?
Hey everyone, excited to be here. I am the Executive Director of Digital Forensics at Lighthouse. I've got a team of about 20 practitioners, former law enforcement, former military forensic examiners, of course. We handle e-discovery ESI collections, but we also do forensic analysis and expert witness testimony.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Okay, so we've divided today's discussion into two parts based on frequent questions that we get from our clients and then the broader market as well. So first, we're going to address the forensic impact of a new normal that is working from home. And then we'll discuss the practical workflows for managing remote data collections. We'll have a little Q&A at the end as well. So a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. If you would like CLE credit, there will be a mandatory survey at the end of the program, and it'll be broadcast in the chat function. And then while we will have the Q&A session at the end, please feel free to submit questions throughout, and we'll try to answer those during the program and try to make this a little interactive. And please use the chat button at the bottom instead of the Q&A button, and it'll get a little confusing, but it makes it easier for us to catch those. There will also be a few poll questions throughout. We hope that you will participate. They are anonymous, so please answer truthfully. And then finally, with most of us working from home these days, please ignore the barking dogs and the uninvited family members that might come into the office or landscapers outside. There's certainly all these distractions that we're all dealing with, so we'll just have to pretend that they're not there. So, great. So why don't we dive right in? Okay, so let's jump in and talk a little bit about the forensic impacts of working from home and some of the challenges from an InfoGov perspective. So Jerry, first question, why is the current work from home situation so different than before? Employees have been working on the road and from home for years now, so why is it so different now?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think the ratio is just so skewed now. I think there's new behavioral norms that we need to get accustomed to. We have to think through what the implications are. I mean, it's skewed to the point where it's not just work from home scenario, but it is work entirely from home, right? Working completely from home. What kind of ramifications are involved? So, while you might go into the office or be on the road, there's certain delineations throughout the workday, but for those of us that are sheltered at home, the opportunities to actually use personal devices and do work from personal devices increases. The ability to do personal work on your work devices, your company issued laptop increases. In the old days, there was just a sliver of the evening perhaps that you were at home, and that was often, things competing for your time, whether it's, having dinner with the family and, doing your bedtime stories, tucking them in. You might do a little bit of work and a little bit of private activities on your devices, but now it's literally throughout the entire day. And if your industry is slowed down, those opportunities actually increase. You're actually flipping back and forth between these devices and doing personal versus work activities all the time. And to kind of try to drive that point home, let's conduct a couple of poll questions here and focus on the behaviors, thinking about how you might use these devices interchangeably without even thinking about it. So if you could, let's answer these with the, with anonymity in mind, or is it really anonymous on the background? Just kidding. So answer these because I think it's going to be beneficial for everyone to see kind of the trend of activities happening interchangeably across these devices. So let's jump into the first poll question. You should see it come up on Zoom webinars here shortly. And to set the stage, poll number one will involve those opportunities where you're using company issued laptops for personal purposes. So look it on the screen. This is multiple choice, select as many as apply. Okay. Are you letting family members use your company issued laptops, perhaps to do Zoom? You know, if you've got children, or they might be Zooming with teachers. If you have a spouse who's a teacher, they might be Zooming with students from your laptop because for some reason they can't launch it from their machines, but so they're using yours. How much personal web browsing are you doing? Everyone does some level of it. Are you doing more of it these days on your corporate laptops? Are you doing social media from your company issued laptops? Are you doing messaging with family and friends using FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, Google Hangouts? Are you playing online poker, for example? I have a weekly poker game with my buddies, and we can't meet in person with social distancing rules. So we're taking that online. The question is whether or not you're doing those types of activity, kind of not really thinking about it and using your corporate laptop. This kind of last option around teledoctor visits and health checkups, which is obviously really relevant today in this world in terms of you know, coronavirus and making sure that, you know, a small cold or flu isn't something more serious. You know, if you're doing that from your corporate laptop, now we're talking about personal health information, PHI, being potentially stored on your work laptops. But if you're ultra diligent, maybe it's none of the above. You've got great data hygiene and you're separating and segregating those activities completely. Go ahead and answer now, and we'll take a look at the results momentarily.
Okay, so pretty small online poker is there. I thought maybe people would be trying to make a little extra bucks while they're working from home. But looks like, you know, most people use personal web browsing and social media on their work computers, which really isn't that surprising. But you know, then we also see almost 40% don't do any of these things, so that's fantastic.
That's great. Thanks for answering honestly there. Let's do the same. Flip side of the coin, poll number 2, with the opportunities for personal computers, okay, personal home computers. How much are you using those for work purposes? And we'll talk through the answers here. So you might be using Zoom again, but again, this is Zooming with colleagues. You might be using MS Teams for your video conferencing. Are you forwarding email attachments from your work account to your personal computer or your personal email accounts, extracting attachments and perhaps editing Word documents, creating PDFs, or using Excel from your home computers? Or if you're bypassing the forwarding email, perhaps you're taking those documents and putting them on a USB thumb drive and plugging it into your home computer, and then operating off of those documents there, right? Your home setup might be much more comfortable than a small screen with your company issued laptop. You might have a really nice large monitor, or maybe dual monitors that you're missing from the home office, but instead you've got it set up at home and you want to simulate the same type of convenience. That could be a reason why you're working on your home computer doing those things. Obviously, with cloud-based platforms like Slack, Office 365, G Suite, Zendesk, Confluence, Jira, it goes on. You know, that becomes much easier to access from your home computer. Are you using that device in order to do work-related activities from these collaboration platforms? And then, are you, again, accessing documents from those corollary document storage accounts, whether it's OneDrive for Office 365, or Google Drive, or Dropbox, Box, OneHub, etc.? Or are you being completely diligent? Select none of the above if that's the case.
Great. Well, again, we have lots of really diligent folks out there with great digital hygiene. 66% don't do any of those things. That's fantastic. And we are still seeing you know, other items like forwarding email attachments and accessing some of those documents and such from their home computers. But it's great to see there's a big percentage that aren't doing that at all. Thanks, everyone. So, okay, so with that, let's jump into the next question, Jerry. In your experience, you know, have employees who are potential custodians in litigation, for example, have they been trained how to segregate their computer behavior and data storage practices on company versus personal hardware?
By and large, no. I think that the home workers are still intermingling the data, even in a pre-COVID-19 world. And I'm sure the other forensic examiners tuning in will agree that there's plenty of mixing of data across all of the different work and company devices. I mean, I think the companies that are really enforcing policies do a better job because they also provide training around this. A lot of companies do contemplate BYOD devices in terms of smartphones. And, you know, I think in this world, realizing that it was such a sudden shift, maybe there wasn't time, but proactively contemplating that extension of policies is, I think, in order to, you know, include the home computers and tablets and, you know, family members' computers, kind of reinforce the same thing that you're doing already today with BYOD smart devices, but with the other ones. Because think about the pressure that IT is under, how they've had to adapt overnight to these changes. And, you know, realizing that if you don't have access to IT within the workplace, if you're not physically in the office, you can't walk up to a help desk support window and say, fix my laptop because X, Y, and Z is broken. As soon as someone's company-issued laptop maybe loses VPN connectivity or passwords expire, there's going to be increasing pressure from IT, especially from executives and engineers who really need to get their work done, are asking IT to relax some of their policies, right? This is my biggest concern. In order to accommodate this work from home environment, the IT policies are being relaxed. And what does that mean? It means that more personal computers can be used, perhaps, you know, especially if you're hosting your enterprise data in Microsoft 365 or G Suite. Now personal computers are being allowed to connect to those things, and, you know, data is being downloaded, communications are being performed from all manner of home devices. So it's a pretty dramatic shift. And in terms of giving you some tips on how policies can be enhanced and not taking a stance where you can't use personal machines at all, because it's going to happen, I think embrace the fact that your workers are working more comfortably, perhaps more productively across their devices, but enforce some practices where they're segregating that work data on home machines or that personal data on work machines. Create a folder within your file structure that is designated as such. So if you download any documents, then you are storing them in isolation on your file system, so that when it comes time for any kind of e-discovery, any kind of preservation, you can point the forensic examiner to that folder and say, I've been completely diligent about storing all my work materials on this folder on my personal machine. So do a target collection on that folder and that folder alone. Or if you're forwarding emails from your corporate account to your personal Gmail, for example, create a subfolder. You have the ability to do that. Put all of those emails into that subfolder within your personal email account. Mimic kind of that MDM philosophy that enterprise IT is doing on your smartphone, because MDM is keeping all of the corporate data sandboxed into a specific area, and the policies dictate that they can delete that when the time comes, if needed, or you know, readily collect that information because it is isolated, it isn't intermingled and dispersed across the entire file system. Because what's impossible to do from a forensic examiner perspective is to distinguish what's personal and what's work if it isn't organized properly. And the best practice there is to collect the entire hard drive, right? And then surface those materials through search terms, right, downstream. But then again, you're now submitting your personal data to that level of processing. And you know, we won't get into a lot of depth around this, but when IT practices are relaxed or IT policies are relaxed, there is more opportunity for insider threats, you know, data exfiltration, and things like that. Cybersecurity is a whole another issue as well. So do note those risks with this COVID-19 era that we're adjusting to.
Right, thanks. And you know, as we all know, it's well settled, at least in the United States, that corporate data stored on personal devices is discoverable, right? So, as this becomes, to your point, a big, increasing challenge to identify and preserve, especially as employees use more diverse applications sort of in different devices and regularly commingle personal in work data. It's only just going to get exacerbated, I think, as especially as the likelihood of work from home is here to stay, at least some form of that. If you take a look, we're not going to go into any of these cases in depth, and most of you have probably seen these before or are familiar with them, but we definitely recommend taking a look at these opinions if you haven't already, just to kind of bone up on what is discoverable and how courts are treating personal and work devices. So I want to jump on the next question. So, what does all this mean, Jerry, for information governance policies? Will there be a policy overhaul that's necessary for even if we're just working from home temporarily?
Yeah, Chris, I think the norms have been shattered. I think we're in a new norm, right? Where industries that never allowed employees to work from home have given them a taste of what it's like to do so, and the convenience and comfort around that, perhaps. And for those of us who are in professions that allow us to work from home all the time, it's nothing new. But kind of the train has left the station, or it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. I think work from home is going to be something that a lot more companies allow now they've given all the ways to taste of it. And so what that means is that new policies are going to have to be adapted. You have to think proactively about this new world and coverage of equipment, personal equipment, as employees start to use them at home. So this COVID-19 era is going to be with us, and the COVID-19 era data mismanagement is always going to be with us. When we have new matters, we're always going to look back and hopefully consider this period of time where the scope of relevant material might reside on a plentiful number or a plethora of devices that you don't normally consider, right? You can't just limit your discovery to just the company issued laptop and just the phone. Custodian questionnaire is going to need to be adapted so that you're really targeting the behavior during this period of time. It's going to be a standard question now included as part of custodian questionnaire. So make sure those get updated as well. So when you are in a reactive situation, you are dealing with a litigation or investigation, you're going to be scoping this out correctly and asking the appropriate questions. And then there's also the issue of review. We're seeing it already with kind of this mixture of personal and work data, and the difficulty surrounding that. And what we've seen in those instances, which again are only going to increase over time, is the potential to run across contraband contained on these collections. I think that is something that you just have to face. Reality is there might be some incidental review of things that the federal government requires, everyone to basically go pencils down. So if you run across, let's just talk about it directly. If you run across child pornography, for example, and we've seen this across personal devices, if you see that, we're required to go pencils down and report this to the federal government. So, the more that personal data is intermingled, the more that you might incidentally run across criminal activity, then there's, perhaps an obligation to report. So again, and reinforce those policies. You don't want to be stuck in a situation where your matter comes to a dead stop because of these types of findings, right, during the course of your review.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now we've identified what these current challenges are. Let's switch over to some practical workflow strategies for the remote ESI collections. So if we're not traveling on site to acquire device and data source evidence, are these collections still considered forensically sound, and is it defensible?
I think a lot of us in the forensic community have thought hard about this because of the movement towards more cloud-based data sources. Things have not been quote unquote forensic for a while. If you think about forensic being defined as, a bit stream exact copy of a hard disk. We don't have access to Apple's data center or Google's data center, Facebook's data center. They very rarely cooperate with those types of subpoenas in the first place, just to get like log level information, much less an actual physical bit by bit image of any of their server hard drives, right? So, it doesn't necessarily need to be forensic to be defensible. That's the message I want to send. So we ask very pointed questions at the outset of a preservation job. So first, what type of case is it? Do we actually need forensic artifacts? And that's what the full physical image, forensic image of a device yields is, those, artifacts that describe web browsing activity, artifacts that describe USB plugins, artifacts that allow you to, or rather unallocated space analysis, where you can look at deleted items and recover those items. So that's the type of investigation or the type of case that you might consider using a forensic approach, right? Whereas if it's more along the lines of a document production, perhaps to a regulatory inquiry, and you're really just looking at custodian communication or custodian user-generated files, that's a different type of collection. And so when we're talking about needing to go on site, right, we can be much more targeted with our remote collections without a forensic component, without the need for a forensic component, if we understand the type of case that is involved. And certainly, in terms of defensibility, you want to talk about the reasonableness of that. And that certainly the health safety risks are something to take into consideration. I truly believe that courts will take that into consideration during the COVID-19 era. When we're talking about why didn't you take a full physical image of this custodian hard drive? Well, we didn't want to get infected by coronavirus. We don't want to spread coronavirus. We're respecting governmental guidance around social distancing rules. Those are all defensible arguments that you can make in order to describe this particular collection at this particular time, if that makes sense. The second question we want to ask is, what type of device or data source is it? All of them, they might not all lend themselves to a remote collection. The newer type of devices, whether it's a MacBook with T2 chip encryption, as an example, we've conquered that already. But there was a time where that was very challenging for us, and we needed an actual examiner to be in the proximity of that device in order to do all the necessary troubleshooting, right? So we'll talk about remote techniques in a second, but again, understanding the type of device involved will help dictate during the scoping process whether or not a remote approach is ideal. And so, if it doesn't suit a remote approach, and we're not using an on-site, we're not going on-site, then the other option is to ship those devices to our forensic lab, or any forensic service provider's forensic lab. So generally, I think, in terms of our experience and what we're seeing within industry, these are kind of the safeguards around approaching this during this time frame. So those are kind of the questions that we should ask during the scoping process, being very thoughtful about whether or not an on-site visit is actually required.
Got it. So what's the process then? How do we recommend collecting from the cloud?
Yeah, so the cloud is by definition a remote collection from the beginning. So a lot of that is status quo. That being said, there's challenging cloud data sources, and they're getting more and more challenging every single day. And I'm including those, cloud-based collaboration platforms, along with social media, for example. They're all stored in the cloud, and we collect those routinely with a remote approach. But in terms of the kind of landscape of cloud data sources and the complexity of it, there's a variety of solutions, whether it's going to be a third-party vended solution, whether it's going to be a forensic tool. A lot of the forensic tools are increasing with their capabilities to collect from the cloud, whether it's Cellebrite, Axiom, and the Black Bag products. They're all incorporating, cloud connectors. And then there's obviously specialists too, like ONA and the like, who are using API methods for gathering that data on our behalf. So the cloud data is actually is mostly status quo during this period, but I don't want to kind of discount the challenges that are involved. And I want to use the opportunity while we have all of these attendees on the webinar to ask them personally what's creating the greatest challenges in terms of cloud-based data sources. So perhaps we can launch poll number 3. All right, poll number 3, folks, if you could draw your attention to this. Again, this is a multiple choice, select as many as apply. Which cloud or social media platforms are giving you the biggest headaches to preserve and acquire today? Microsoft 365. This, by the way, is the new branding for Office 365. So if you become used to saying O365, and you may have heard me say that during this webinar, it's M365 going forward. G Suite, Slack, Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp, we put that all into one choice because they're all owned by Facebook, and it is by far the most popular messaging platforms across the world, except for China, where WeChat is the most popular. Twitter, or none of the above. I doubt, well, I don't want to bias you, but let's see what people are having the most challenges collecting from the cloud.
Okay, so looks like Slack's the big winner here, but clearly all of these platforms are providing or lending challenges to the audience. And it's not just a collection of these products either, of this data. It's the downstream e-discovery workflows and processes from review and production as well that get into the mix here too. Okay. So we did receive a question, Jerry, and it's probably not the time to get into it too deeply here, but it was asking about collection from Microsoft Teams.
Sure.
And we don't want to get into the weeds with this at all, but any comments there? And I should just note to the audience, we do have future webinars. We'll be talking about some of these Microsoft products as well. So be sure to join those and to get some more insight. But any quick thoughts on Teams?
Yep. So we fortunately have specialists within our advisory group that do collect from Microsoft 365, including Teams. So everything within that Microsoft 365 suite is included. And while it's part of the cloud-based administrative console for collection, there are things to consider there. So, but the security and compliance center and some of the search facilities provided within those admin consoles should allow you to collect the data, but there are definitely tips and tricks that we can provide around that.
Great, thanks. Okay, so what are the recommendations, Jerry, for on-site collections when offices and data centers are closed? How do we manage that?
Yeah, so when they don't have their enterprise data in the cloud, so if they're still operating in an on-prem model where you've got Exchange server, you have file servers, and other databases that are located on-prem, and nowadays when employees are not coming to the office, how do we collect that data? It's challenging, but not insurmountable. So if you're talking about on-premises collections, what we rely on are those skeleton crews that are still being asked to come into the office, those essential workers, those heroes in my mind that are still coming to the office and supporting the upkeep, maintenance, and uptime for all of these servers. So the rest of us can actually enjoy working remotely. And so they can handle these remote kits that we send to the end client, to the corporations. They can identify the servers like Exchange server or the file servers where they can plug in an external USB pin pad drive. These are encrypted drives into the USB 3.0 ports and have those drives preloaded with forensic software, right? And not all forensic software needs to be installed on the actual host machine. So there are lightweight versions of NK. So there's lightweight versions of FTK that you can use once the drive is plugged in and you've arranged a remote screen share session with someone that has administrative access to that server or to the network. And we can take, or any service provider can take control of virtual keyboards and conduct the collections that way, as if they were sitting right in front of the machine itself. So that's definitely something that you'll want to leverage, is doing preloaded software. There's also a solution if you need specific software that requires dongle licenses, like maybe there's cell phones sitting at the head office, the corporate office, and you need to use Celebrite in order to do those collections. So you can also send a forensic laptop, right, along with the external USB encrypted hard drive. And you might not want to send that Celebrite dongle. It's expensive, right? They're very valuable. And you don't want them to get lost in the mail. You don't want them to be damaged or broken on the other side, or have them, somehow the IT person might forget to send it back. Who knows? There's all reasons why you want to secure that very expensive dongle. There's a tool called FlexiHub that will you can have the USB software license plugged into your machine at the service provider's office and reroute that license through the internet to the forensic laptop, and thereby enabling the running of that software remotely to collect things like cell phones. So that's one strategy for facilitating those collections if an extra software dongle is needed.
So Jerry, another audience question. It's actually more about if you had to go on site to do a collection, that was the only option. What are the safety protocols that you need to follow if that actually happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, perhaps there's firewall issues or other reasons why we can't do those on-prem collections remotely. We definitely have safeguards in place. So we want to evaluate, after evaluating the necessity for going on site, and if we deem that that's something that is absolutely required, we will send out, we suggest that COVID-19 questionnaires are created. And those questionnaires are going to ask the host facility if anyone that the examiner is coming in contact with has been in a COVID-19 hotspot, for example, right? One of those cities that are considered epicenters, whether it's New York or Seattle, New Orleans, et cetera. The list is growing, unfortunately. But if they've been there recently within 14 days, whether or not they're exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19, even if they haven't been tested and officially diagnosed, whether or not anyone they've come in contact, our host, the host's employees, whether they've come into anyone contact, not just colleagues, but friends and family members who exhibit symptoms, and whether or not that host facility has practices in place to clean the high traffic common areas on a regular basis, multiple times a day, whether that's going to be the elevator or bathrooms or the hallways. Are those being wiped down and sanitized in a way? And we certainly suggest that any of the forensic outfits out there equip themselves with PPE, right? So using that personal protective equipment, gloves, masks, and bring sanitizing equipment in the form of sprays, but sprays that are safe for devices, and also perhaps a UV wand, even pack that as part of your on-site visit, so that you can go through some decontamination procedures as you handle custodian devices on site, or as you touch servers on site, and certainly as you share and hand off equipment, not hand off, but leave it somewhere following social distancing rules, so that the IT person can come and pick that up. So sanitizing it, making sure you have the PPE. Those are the steps that we will require before an on-site visit is actually performed.
Great, thanks. And presumably those are the types of things we do here.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what about the employee that's sitting at home, working from home, and you have to collect information from them? I suspect there are similarities to working with the folks at the data centers, but employees often have limited IT support now, or they have no technical background. How do you manage that?
Right, we try to make it as easy as possible, certainly. So that a kickoff call, interacting with the custodian will help us assess their level of technical savviness. But it's not unlike what we do with the on-prem remote approach, which is sending either a forensic drive or a forensic laptop. But the specific steps that we outline and document include receiving that equipment, going through perhaps their own, decontamination procedures. We certainly decontaminate and sanitize it before we ship on our end, using the same protocol that I mentioned earlier. But once they receive it, they plug in the encrypted hard drive, perhaps to their own personal machine or company-issued laptop, punch in the PIN code in order to unlock the drive where the preloaded forensic software exists, connect their machine to their home internet Wi-Fi connection, and then launch the remote screen sharing session. As soon as those kind of three major steps are accomplished, then it's as if the forensic examiner is sitting in front of the machine with hands-on keyboard, running the software tools, doing the collections as prescribed.
Perfect. So, okay, so the collections have been done. These remote collections are done, and we need to get the data out to the service provider to manage, the downstream e-discovery workflows and data processing. It's certainly uncertain times. There's theories or discussions around how long the COVID-19 can stay in the air, how long can it stay or remain active on metals and cardboard and things of that nature. So there's certainly some fear around that. So how do we handle the shipping of the evidence or getting that back to people that are sheltered at home or can't freely drop off those packages at their local FedEx shop?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we can conduct the remote collection without sending any equipment, we will. So like I said, the forensic tool or the forensic software can be they have very lightweight versions that we can email or provide for download across on our servers. And then it can be launched from the machine, and then once it's collected and staged in a certain area as a forensic container or in a zip file perhaps, making sure to preserve all of the ESI metadata, the data can be delivered to the service provider through FTP, right? So that's a digital transfer of that evidence across the internet. A lot of that has been performed in the past for smaller size evidence or smaller size collections, but now we are opening the door to much larger volumes over FTP. And a lot of service providers like Lighthouse are making accommodations for that in terms of capacity, staging areas on the network, larger pipes, perhaps better throughput to the extent that that's controllable, so that we can receive, so that the custodians can upload, and then the service provider can receive these larger volumes of data. Now, rather than going through your typical web browser interface for those FTP uploads, which can break during the course of a larger upload, we also provide instructions, or you should provide instructions around using things like FTP clients, right, which have the capability for resuming broken uploads. So there's no need to start over. So things like FileZilla, Qt FTP, those are all things that the IT personnel or custodians can install in order to facilitate a more reliable connection. Just understanding that there are there's extra time that's required, turnaround times to consider, in terms of these digital transfers, especially dependent on their size. But it is a trade-off between waiting for this evidence in order to receive it, process it, and conduct review on it, versus putting yourself at risk by taking that package to a FedEx drop-off, and you might even be stopped along the way if the jurisdictional guidelines are strict and you can't even be out on the streets. Certainly a trade-off that allows some business continuity. And the message here is that while things might be a little bit more complicated, things might take a little bit more time in order to conduct collections, it doesn't stop. These activities don't grind to a halt. Our industry still moves forward, and the collections still do proceed as planned. We just have to be more thoughtful and create additional protocols surrounding that.
Great. So another question, you've kind of, a question from the audience, you've kind of addressed this somewhat, but the question is, the ways to do this without shipping things. And certainly things from the cloud we can gather, but what about some of those large data sources? I mean, is it required to send these forensic devices on the way, or is it, to the location, or can we do it more virtually now?
Yeah, I think more virtually. We've always had these capabilities. I think they'll just be considered more seriously and leveraged more frequently now. But there's remote capabilities for almost every data source, save for those really complicated ones that will want forensic examiners to troubleshoot. We don't want the CEO of a company who's having his laptop collected, or someone that's not comfortable doing a lot of technical workarounds. I mean, another technique that we've used too, because if you're troubleshooting a machine that for collection, and screen shares only allow you to interact with the machine with that is connected to the internet, right? Or that will turn on. Sometimes we'll use FaceTime, so use the camera on the ideally your work phone, but use the camera to do a FaceTime session so that the examiner can actually have virtual eyes on the device. When we talk about a remote screen share session, we're talking about virtual hands-on keyboard. Let's give the remote examiner the ability to have virtual eyes on a device if for some reason there's any troubleshooting or workarounds required. So that's another technique that we've used in the past. But ultimately, there's a remote solution for everything, or for most things. If not, then we'll ask that the device be shipped in, and instead of going to a drop-off location, there's also the ability for us to schedule courier pickups as well, so that the custodian or our clients won't have to interact with with these couriers. With these drive and go to these drop-off centers and flout the social distancing guidelines.
Great, thanks, Jerry. This is all really great stuff. So before we jump into Q&A, and again, to the audience, please send us some questions that you might have, and we'll try to get them answered in the next 15 minutes that we have. But before we get there, let's probably give you three key takeaways really from based on the discussion today, and things that Jerry and I have been talking about. So I would say that I would say one, it's probable that commingled personal and company data will increase. It already exists, but it's going to increase in the wake of this new normal and people having to work from home. And it's important for case teams to not just recognize this, but to think about and be thoughtful about how they are working about identifying the potential sources of information and what their approach would be, perhaps updating and adapting their custodian questionnaires to make sure that they're asking the right questions to ferret out where this additional ESI might be. And then I guess probably most importantly is that discovery workflows don't really need to stop, right? There's data acquisition efforts can continue. It might be a little more difficult or have additional steps that have to be taken and take a little longer. But as Jerry just said, we can collect just about everything remotely these days, even in this environment of shelter in place and social distancing. So with that, why don't we open it up for some questions from the audience? Okay, so I guess the first question, and something I thought about, and that we also got it from the audience here as well, is if we're able to do all of this so well remotely, why would we ever go back to on-site data collections in the future, right? Like, and incur the cost of travel and food and mileage and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think these capabilities have always been there, but some clients have not been accustomed to using remote or are more hesitant to use it. But the upside of this whole experience, we're hoping, I speak for a lot of the practitioners, the forensic practitioners in industry, is that we'll do a lot more remote collection because just the amount, the cost, and of traveling to places do physical collections when they're not necessarily needed, is kind of burdensome for the client in terms of turnaround times. It's less efficient. It's more costly, and thinking about carbon footprint, that's also important to reduce too. So I think more serious consideration will be taken for remote opportunities, especially now that we're doing more and more of it, and folks are starting to get or starting to feel comfortable around the approach, because it's certainly a feasible solution given the right scenarios. So asking those appropriate questions up front during the scoping process will help ferret out the ability to do so.
Perfect. So, with that, what logistical challenges are you typically faced with when it comes to these remote collections?
Yeah, I mean, even in a non-COVID-19 world, there are things that come up, even for device and type and data sources that we have collected successfully in the past. There's always those gotcha moments, and there's going to be cooperation and patience needed around all parties involved. I think the most important thing that we could recommend is that we just over communicate when those things happen, right? If there is any kind of potential impact to the time involved or the cost, we should raise those issues ahead of time, especially as responsible service providers. Those will be rescoped for appropriately, because there are unexpected things that happen during the course of a collection. Expect the unexpected.
Great. Okay, so questions are flowing now, so this is great. Okay, so if we perform a remote collection over the web, where you're controlling all that process, will it allow you to then serve as a 30B6 witness?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we've testified to remote collections all the time. So making sure that you're taking the appropriate screenshots, making sure that you're taking the appropriate notes, handling the chain of custody, all of those things, especially when you have eyes on the session. I wouldn't, just, tell the custodian to do X, Y, and Z and walk away, right? Make sure you're monitoring, especially when you're, for example, doing a remote exchange server collection, right, where you might rely on IT personnel to run the PowerShell scripts. It's important to look at the commands that are being typed in, right, to the server, right, and either taking a video or taking the screenshots and documenting it appropriately, or providing them with the PowerShell scripts in the first place. If for some reason you're not able as the forensic examiner to actually launch, do this yourself, make sure you're providing the instructions, the step-by-step instructions, and also monitoring it with your own eyes during a remote screen share session. Don't just rely on, audible confirmation, because things can be misinterpreted that way.
Right, which kind of lends to another question here is, how important is it during the scoping call and work to see the custodian?
Yeah, sometimes it is. Like I said, so it's not just the screen share session. This is perhaps another evolution of what we'll see coming out of COVID-19 is like these Zoom video conferencing, see the other person type norms. I think it's immensely helpful because if we can perhaps include that as part of our remote kits, it makes understanding each other, especially when there's a technical barrier, understanding each other is so much easier just looking at the expression of the person. And, just having that virtual human, full-blown virtual human interaction where a normal on-site visit would be, preferable, much more realistic or much more simulated towards a on-site collection, scenario. So certainly seeing the other person is helpful for those kind of human reasons.
Great. Okay, so a question about technologies. Are there any new technologies on the horizon that will significantly improve download speed to FTP? And maybe this is something like a spare or some other technologies that you're working with.
Yep, I got a 2-character answer for you: 5G. 5G is going to change the way we do collections in a dramatic way. Because if you're talking about 5G speeds for collection purposes, you're now penetrating those remote locations that don't have reliable internet, right? And you could, with the bandwidth, realistically perform these collections remotely in far-flung places. I cannot wait for 5G for that reason. So, that technology is, on the verge of being available to everyone. It might take some years, but, in the relative near future, I think 5G is going to change the game. But otherwise, there's technologies, some, pretty amazing compression technologies around tools like Aspera that go across the internet, and working with existing bandwidth allow for ostensibly faster transfers.
Great. Okay, next question. Would you recommend reminding personnel that are on legal hold and working remotely to protect and preserve their data per company protocols? My guess is yes. But there's certainly some changes. But I think it kind of gets back to that original, or some of the original discussion points that we talked about. Sort of upgrading policy, information governance policies around how their employees are creating and storing information, both in the workplace and then at home and on personal devices.
This is a great question, because these personal devices especially are outside the reach of IT, right? So you're not conducting normal backups, right? You're not able to flip the switch and do a legal hold. It's totally outside the purview of IT. So the policies and the training are going to be paramount in terms of effectuating cooperation from these custodians. So certainly, if it's work-related material, especially relevant to an active matter or a imminent matter, absolutely are subject to legal hold and preservation. And maybe thinking around the potential risk too. I forgot to mention this earlier, but again, being outside of the company premises, I did talk about potential insider threat and how that might increase. Remember, you don't have all of the monitoring tools available to you, because those often work across the corporate network. It certainly doesn't bypass a home network's router and monitor that session. It's not part of the Active Directory, not part of the enterprise network, of course. And there's other things too to consider. Is what about the physical safeguards that are in place in the office, whether it's badging or surveillance cameras? Those are all kind of ways that we help triangulate evidence from multiple data sources in order to augment the case, right? And now those are completely unavailable to us. We can't use those to corroborate bad actor activity, rogue employees, for example. So if you're thinking about kind of that compliance risk, it can go further undetected rather, outside of the office walls. So that kind of just sparked some ideas for me. So thanks for that question.
Okay, so one of the things that we hear a lot about on the news too, and this is coming from a question from the attendees as well, is with everybody working from home, it seems to be a strain on some bandwidth, especially in certain areas. Are there ways that which could potentially slow down remote collections? So are there ways or tips and tricks to free up the bandwidth, or to speed up the data transfers, aside from what we've already talked about?
Yeah, I think there is. One is to upgrade your connection. And a lot of companies, really great companies, are actually taking on the cost of that. So if for example, if you think you have a good home connection, it's often really fast on the download, but really poor on the upload speeds. Right? When you're talking about home internet, there's now options to have equivalent upload speeds. In some areas, like mine here in Dallas, with my internet provider, I get gigabit speeds on the down and the up. Right, so it's kind of having that upload speed, taking advantage of that additional upload bandwidth. Now, agreed that it's hard to do with a custodian, who it's more of an ad hoc type of collection to kind of ask them to upgrade their speed. But I mean, more often than not, they're able to push that button at the at the internet provider's office. I mean, it's just a matter of subscribing to that. I mean, that's a scoping question we should ask. What are your home internet speeds? What's the down and what's the up, if they know, right? And do they have the ability to upgrade? I mean, it just depends on you know, how important the collection is, right? The burden or the proportionality around it. Because if it's a, you know, witness versus a, you know, a party to a litigation, those are different kind of things to consider for, you know, a massive collection, especially, right? If we're talking about, you know, upwards of 20 devices, which we see upwards of 20 personal devices, you know, from time to time. That might justify for remote purposes an upgrade in bandwidth, and perhaps a temporary upgrade for a given month. So those are the things that I would look into. Certainly setting up an Aspera type of connection, you know, using standard internet, but using software that's better at the encryption. There is some setup involved, not terribly burdensome, but that there is some setup on both ends that need to occur in order to take advantage of an Aspera solution. A-S-P-E-R-A, Aspera.
Perfect. All right, a couple more questions. I think we have a little bit of time here. So one is fairly specific, and I know we don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but I want to get your thoughts on this. You know, is there a method that you recommend for collecting a large volume of specific folders? The audience member uses the number 100 from a large Google Drive account where Google Vault isn't an option. It's not an option.
Yeah. Yeah, you would make this hard. And you know, I have questions around that. Are all 100 folders for one custodian? You know, are they for multiple custodians? You know, there's tools like F-Response, for example, where if using an administrative account, you can go in and select the, you know, the custodians. But you might not be able to target the exact folders in question, but really the balance there is, you know, collecting, over collecting, and then filtering downstream, right? Because there's extra time involved up front to perhaps cherry pick these collections. If you don't have access to Vault, you know, you have to cherry pick folders, and you might have to do those as singular, discrete jobs in order to finish the whole thing. And it might take a forensic examiner days in order to do that cherry picking versus collecting broadly and then filtering downstream, either by directory path or by keywords or what have you. But you know, F-Response is one of those tools, one of many tools that allow you to connect to Google Drive and perform the collection. I mean, there are certain tools that will, you know, cloud-based tools that will do a triage, but be careful and make sure you understand up front that when a cloud-based solution is doing, allows you to do advanced triage type capabilities, they're likely taking a full-blown replica of your repository, and you have to consider whether or not you want another instance of your data residing with another vendor for that level of convenience. But for, you know, from an e-discovery perspective, it's always been kind of best practice to over-collect, just, you know, for various reasons, including you don't want to go back to the well and recollect, trying to distinguish the delta, especially if there's large overlap. There's great expense in actually processing that and then deduplicating it just to get the delta. So getting it right, getting it broadly collected up front is just so much more convenient and perhaps time and cost saving in the final analysis.
Great. So there were a few other questions. Sorry, we're just about out of time for today. So sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but certainly feel free to follow up with us or your local rep if you have some additional questions. We're happy to answer those. Thank you all for joining. Just as another reminder, if you're requesting a CLE credit, there will be a link in the chat window below that you will need to complete. It is mandatory. I will say it's pretty easy, so don't worry too much about it. But make sure you take care of that, and we'll take care of the CLE credits for you. And then stay safe, everyone. We hope you will tune in again next week, and we hope this was helpful. And some of the follow-up materials that you will get will be links to register for next week's and future events. Stay safe. Talk soon.
Thanks for joining.